My name is Michael. I'm 61 years old, though I don't look it. The reflection in the mirror tells a different story, one of worn lines, graying hair, and a face that has seen more than it cares to remember. But the truth is, when you've lived as long as I have, age isn't something you think about every day. It's more like the air around you, there, but easy to forget until it hits you all at once. I suppose you could say I'm the type of man who's learned to let the past slip away, like water down a drain. The things I've lost are things I can never get back, and so I don't waste time trying to hold on to them. I once had everything a man could ask for. A business I'd started from the ground up, hard work, long hours, and a touch of luck that made it grow. I had a wife who stood by me through thick and thin, and we had a daughter who was the light of our lives. That was the dream. The house we built, the weekends spent in the yard, the dinners at the table. Those moments of warmth and laughter. They felt like they'd last forever. But forever doesn't exist. At least not the way we think it does. The divorce came when I wasn't looking. It wasn't a single event. No dramatic moment where everything shattered in an instant. No, it was the slow burn of distance, of misunderstanding, of people changing when they didn't expect to. My wife became someone I didn't recognize. Her ambition grew, and with it, her desires changed. The house we'd built, the life we'd shared. It all became a symbol of what we were no longer. She wanted something more, something different, and I couldn't give it to her. So she left. She took everything she could, and in the end, she left me with the empty house, the empty yard, the empty life. I tried to fight for it. Hell, I tried to save it. But when you've been left behind, you learn there's nothing you can do. I won't pretend to understand what happened or why it did. There's no real answer to that. People change. People drift apart. And sometimes you wake up one day and realize you're standing in the ruins of what used to be your world, wondering where it all went wrong. That's when I stopped fighting. I lost the business too, though that part was less painful than the loss of her. A few bad deals, some unwise investments, and the next thing I knew, I was left with nothing but a small savings account and the knowledge that I was too old to start over. It was the kind of knowledge that didn't hit you all at once. It came in pieces. First the shame of having to sell off what little was left, then the reality of living alone in a house that felt like it was mocking me. Now I work as a night security guard. It's not glamorous, but it's work, and it pays the bills. I live in a small apartment on the edge of town, a place that's quiet and solitary. I don't mind it. The solitude is easier to handle than the constant reminders of a life that once was. I'm not trying to climb back to the top. There's no point in that anymore. I've made peace with it. Or maybe it's better to say that I've accepted it. The world moves on, and so do I. But every now and then, when I walk past the mirror or hear the distant hum of traffic, I feel it, like a tug at the back of my mind. The feeling that something is missing, something I once had, something I'll never have again. Maybe that's just how it is for people like me. We're not meant to have it all, not meant to keep it all. We're just here for the ride, like everyone else, except when the ride's over, we're left standing alone at the end. The job came to me at a time when I wasn't sure I had many options left. The bills were piling up, and the loneliness was starting to feel like a permanent fixture. I wasn't looking for much, just something steady, something that didn't require too much effort or thought. A man my age, with my history, doesn't exactly have his pick of the lot. But when a friend of a friend reached out to me with an opening for a security guard at an elite residential area, I didn't hesitate. The place was called Riverstone Estates, a gated community at the edge of town, full of sprawling mansions and shiny cars, the kind of place where money was as common as air, and the gates were high enough to keep out the real world. But to me, it was just a job. I went to the interview. A man named Greg, who seemed more interested in his own reflection than in anything I had to say, handed me the application. He barely looked up when he gave me the rundown of what would be expected. Night shifts, watching the cameras, making sure no one tried to sneak in or out. Simple enough. The pay wasn't bad either. I didn't ask too many questions. At my age, jobs like this don't come around often. A few days later, I received the call. I was hired. The assignment, house number 37. The first night on the job, I arrived at the gate, my heart sinking a little as I passed through the entrance. I was handed the security badge, shown the control room, and given a brief rundown of the security systems. I nodded along, but my mind was already elsewhere, already zoning out to the quiet rhythm of the night. The house at number 37 was the first on the left as you drove through the estate. It was a massive, modern structure. White walls, black trim, sleek and minimalist. The sort of house you'd see in a magazine. The kind that looked more like a showroom than a home. When I walked inside, everything was pristine, untouched. The floors were polished, the furniture was carefully placed, and there was a cold, sterile air to the place that didn't feel at all like a home. I spent the first few hours walking through the halls, checking doors, making sure everything was locked. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it felt empty. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the strange newness of it all. I remember the smell of the wood, the varnish in the air, and the distant creak of the stairs underfoot. Something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. I walked into the kitchen and touched the marble countertops, running my fingers over the smooth surface. The way the light hit the edges, casting long shadows in the corners, it reminded me of something. But what? I kept moving through the house, checking the security system, glancing out the large windows that overlooked the backyard. Everything was so well kept, too perfect. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been here before. I couldn't shake the sense that this place knew me. The way the light filtered through the glass, the way the stairs creaked just slightly when I stepped on them, the scratch on the hardwood floor in the corner of the living room. I knew this place. I stopped for a moment, standing still in the center of the room. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. That's when it hit me. The sound of the house, the subtle creaks of the floorboards, the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I had heard all of it before. I ran my hand along the railing of the staircase, tracing the same spot I had noticed when I first entered. That scratch! It was exactly where it had been, and I knew the story behind it. My daughter had done it years ago. She had dragged a chair across the floor, and it left a mark that I always intended to fix but never did. This was my house, my home. The realization came slowly, quietly, like an old memory surfacing at the edges of your mind. It wasn't like an epiphany, not the way you might imagine it. There was no grand moment of shock. It was just a simple, painful understanding that grew heavier and heavier as I moved through the house. House number 37 was my old home. I didn't know how to react. The house had changed. It was still beautiful, but it wasn't the same. The walls were colder now, the furnishings sharper, more modern. But I recognized it. The layout, the windows, the staircase, the kitchen counter where I used to make breakfast with my wife, the way the hallway bent, the little nook by the front door where we used to hang our coats. The house hadn't changed, but I had. And someone else was living in my life now. I glanced around again, half expecting to hear footsteps, but the house remained still, unmoving. The new owner was nowhere to be found. It was the middle of the night, after all. The house belonged to me in that moment, as it always had. There was no one here to claim it. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the dark, empty yard. The lights from the nearby houses cast long shadows on the ground. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of traffic, a sound that felt so foreign to me now. For a moment, I felt something welling up inside me, a mixture of loss and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Anger, perhaps, or just sadness. A deep, aching sadness for what I had lost, for what was never going to be mine again. And then, just like that, I heard the sound of a door opening upstairs. It was him, the new owner. I had known it was coming. Of course I had, but there was something unsettling about hearing it, about knowing someone else was walking through my home, moving in ways that I used to. It wasn't his fault. He had no idea who I was, no idea that this was my house. He was just a young guy, maybe in his 30s, living in the place I once lived in. I couldn't bring myself to confront him. I had no reason to. This was the best thing that could have happened. The first few nights were a blur. I went about my usual routine, walking through the house, checking the security system, making sure everything was locked and in order. But all the while, something gnawed at me, a quiet awareness I couldn't ignore. The house was mine. There was no getting around it. I knew the feel of every inch of it, the texture of the hardwood floor underfoot, the soft creak of the staircase when you took the first step, the way the hallway turned just slightly to the left before opening into the living room. These were things I had lived with, things I had come to know intimately over the years. They had been part of me, like the breath in my lungs, the pulse in my chest. It wasn't until the third day, when I was standing in the kitchen and looking out the window toward the backyard, that I truly realized the full weight of what was happening. The new owner hadn't spoken to me much. I'd seen him briefly on the first night when he came down to check something on the security panel, but he didn't seem to notice me, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge me. I was just the night guard, someone who was supposed to stay in the background, out of sight, unnoticed. The first night, he had walked right past me without even a glance. He didn't know who I was, and that was fine with me. But on the third night, he came down to the kitchen again, the same as before. His footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, like he wasn't quite sure of what he wanted to do in the space. I watched him from the hallway, hidden from his view. He was a tall man, sharp-featured, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in a place like this. Young, successful, and confident. But there was something about him, a way he carried himself, that made me feel like he was just as lost as I was. He opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and poured himself a glass. Then he sat at the counter, staring out the window at the same backyard that I once looked out at in the mornings, drinking my coffee with my wife. I felt the weight of the moment. I wanted to approach him, say something, but I held back. What would I even say? The house wasn't mine anymore. She had taken it. She had walked away, and now this stranger had claimed it. But there was no need to talk to him. I knew him already. He didn't know me, of course. He didn't know anything about who I was or where I'd come from. To him, I was just another nameless face, just another security guard in a long line of people he'd never think twice about. And that was how it should be. There was no reason for me to involve myself in his life. But still, I couldn't help but wonder, did he feel the weight of the house the way I did? Did he know that this place had a history, a life, a story? Or was it just another expensive property to him? Nothing more than walls and floors, a status symbol to keep up appearances. He finished his drink and left the kitchen without a word, disappearing into the shadows of the house. And I was left there, alone with my thoughts, standing in the very spot where I had stood countless times before, years ago, when life was whole and the house was a home. It was then that the reality of the situation truly hit me. This was no longer my life. This was no longer my house. And the man who lived here now? He was simply the next in line, the one who would live in the place I had built, in the place that had once meant everything to me. He didn't know it, but his life would be shaped by the same house that shaped mine. The same walls, the same floors, the same memories that had lingered in the corners, in the spaces between the rooms. The house would have its effect on him, just as it had on me, just as it had on my wife, just as it had on all the people who had come and gone. But I wasn't going to let it affect me anymore. I wasn't going to let the ghosts of the past haunt me. The next night, I wandered through the house again, as I always did. The familiar sights, the sounds, the smells, they were like old friends that you'd left behind but never quite forgotten. I went through the motions, checking doors, looking at the security cameras, making sure everything was in place, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment in the kitchen. The new owner, drinking his water, staring out at the backyard. I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. It was quiet, simmering beneath the surface, a reminder of everything I had lost. It wasn't about the house. It was never about the house. It was about what the house represented, what it had once been. But there was something else, too, a strange sense of liberation. For the first time, I realized that I no longer needed this place. I didn't need to keep fighting for something I couldn't change. The house, my old life, it was all gone. But that didn't mean I was lost. I wasn't defined by what I had once had, by the family I had lost, by the business that had crumbled. I had moved on. I had learned to move forward. And the more I wandered through those old rooms, the more I realized that this place, this house, wasn't going to hold me back anymore. It wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't anything to me but a memory. And sometimes, memories are the heaviest things to carry. But I was done carrying them. The nights were long in that house, and with each passing hour, my mind wandered back to the past. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside the windows, every faint smell of wood and dust, it all brought me back. I couldn't help it. This house, these walls, they held everything. I remember when I first laid eyes on the house, before we even moved in. My wife and I had just bought it, and it was everything we had ever dreamed of. It was perfect. I could still see her face as she walked through the front door for the first time, that look of wonder in her eyes as she took in the grand staircase, the high ceilings, the way the light filtered in through the large windows. It had felt like the start of something beautiful, something lasting. The living room had always been my favorite. It was where we'd spent countless hours, talking, laughing, arguing, everything a family does. I can still see her sitting on the couch, with our daughter curled up beside her. The way my daughter's small hand fit into hers, the way my wife would lean into me when she was tired or worried. There was a warmth in that room, a kind of peaceful comfort that I couldn't explain. And then there were the stairs. I used to carry our daughter up those stairs when she was just a toddler, her little arms wrapped around my neck, her soft giggles filling the air. The stairs had always been a symbol of home to me. Each step was a memory, each creak a reminder of those moments that were once so simple. But that was before the cracks started to appear, before success, or what we thought was success, began to change everything. It started slowly, like a dull ache that you couldn't quite name, but over time it grew. My wife, who had once been so grounded, so full of life and warmth, began to change. She started working longer hours, spending more time away from home, and when she was there, she seemed distant, distracted. The house, once a place of laughter, slowly became a place of silence. I remember one night, sitting in that very living room, the room that had once been filled with our voices. My wife sat across from me, her eyes tired, her hands twisting a napkin. She said nothing, but I could see it in her face, the way she looked at me as though I were a stranger. It was as though the house, the very place we had built together, had somehow turned against us, each room pushing us further apart. It was her success that did it, the business she had worked so hard to build, the things she had achieved. But it wasn't just the success. It was how she started to define herself by it. She became someone else, someone who didn't need me anymore, someone who didn't need the life we had built together. And that's when the cracks deepened. We tried to make it work, of course. I remember the nights we'd talk about fixing things, but the conversations were always the same. Promises, excuses, silence. And then came the divorce. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could move on. But when she walked out the door, taking our daughter with her, it felt like the world had cracked open beneath my feet. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love now felt like a tomb, a cold, empty shell. I didn't want to leave. It was my home. It was where I had built my life. But in the end, it wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to her, to the life she had chosen. And so I left. But the memories stayed. They always stayed. The first night I spent here, in this house, as the security guard, was a surreal experience. It was the same house, the same layout, the same warmth and coolness in different rooms. The air smelled the same, the old wood that had aged and settled over the years. But it was no longer the home I had known. The echoes of our life together hung in the corners, like ghosts. I walked through the rooms, each step taking me back in time. The kitchen where we had cooked meals together. The dining room where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays. Even the hallway, where I would catch glimpses of my daughter running past, her small feet pattering on the floor. And then there was the backyard, the same one I had watched through the window just a few days ago. I stood there now, looking out at the garden we had worked on together. I remember the day we planted the rose bushes along the fence, the way she had smiled when the first bloom appeared. But now, everything was different. The garden was overgrown, the grass unruly. I could almost hear her voice, calling to me from the kitchen, but it was just the wind, rustling the leaves. There were no more voices here. Only silence. I kept my distance from the new owner. I didn't want to engage with him. He didn't know who I was, and I was fine with that. It was better this way. I didn't need him to know the history of the house. I didn't need to remind myself of it either. But still, sometimes I couldn't help but watch him. He seemed so out of place, like a character in someone else's story, trying to fit into a life that wasn't his. He would walk through the house as though he was trying to make himself at home, but it wasn't the same. He wasn't the one who had built it. He wasn't the one who had filled it with memories. There was a part of me that wanted to shake him, tell him that this place wasn't just a house. It was a home. But I didn't. I simply watched, from the shadows, as he lived in the spaces I once lived in. I watched as he stood in the kitchen, the same place where I had stood so many times before. And I couldn't help but wonder if he would ever know the weight of this place, the ghosts that lingered in the air, the memories that shaped everything. But maybe it was better that he didn't know. Maybe it was better that he stayed oblivious. This house wasn't for him. It wasn't for anyone anymore. It had given me everything it could. And now, it was time for me to let go. The days stretched on, and with each passing shift, I fell deeper into the quiet rhythm of my new life. I became more familiar with the house, its nooks and crannies, its familiar scents and sounds, but also with the new owner. He was, in many ways, a typical young man, brash and full of confidence. He would often have friends over, laughing loudly in the evenings, filling the house with noise, like a strange contrast to the quiet memories that filled the rooms. At first, I kept my distance. My job was simple: keep an eye on things, ensure the property was secure, and remain invisible. The new owner, I thought, had no reason to acknowledge me, and I had no reason to get involved with him. But then, as the days passed, something started to change. It wasn't much at first, just an offhand comment or a dismissive glance. But little by little, it became more apparent. He was treating me like I didn't exist. as though I were nothing more than a piece of furniture, something that could be ignored, or worse, taken for granted. The first time it really hit me was when he asked me to leave the front door open. It was a simple request, and in any other situation, it wouldn't have bothered me. But there was something in the way he said it, like I was supposed to just obey without question, without regard for anything other than his convenience. I knew this house, these walls, better than anyone, and I knew how to protect them. But to him, I was just some invisible figure whose presence was more of an inconvenience than anything else. I had learned to bite my tongue. At first, I kept my head down, focused on my work, and tried not to let his condescension get to me. But as the days passed, it became harder and harder to ignore the way he would speak to me. He didn't care about me as a person, as someone who had once lived here, as someone who had built this house with his own hands. No, to him, I was just an old man, someone to be discarded. One evening, after he came home from an afternoon with friends, I was outside doing my usual rounds. He was standing by the door, clearly drunk, leaning against the frame, his words slurred. "Hey, old man," he shouted, making no attempt to be discreet. "Close the damn door. You're letting the cold air in." I could feel the weight of his gaze, the dismissive look that followed the words. He didn't even bother to say please. It was as though I was a servant to him, someone beneath his notice, beneath his regard. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure what to say, what to feel. Anger, frustration, resentment, they all burned inside me, but I knew there was no use in showing it. I didn't need to explain anything to him. Instead, I simply walked over to the door, shut it quietly, and moved back to my post. That night, I found myself pacing the grounds, my mind spinning. I couldn't quite pinpoint why it hurt so much. Maybe it was because I had lived here, in this house, for so many years. It had been mine, and now it was his. And the fact that he didn't see it for what it was, the history it held, the weight of the lives that had been lived inside these walls, that bothered me more than I was willing to admit. It wasn't just the door. It wasn't just the way he spoke to me, dismissing me as though I were invisible. It was the way he treated the house, too, like it was just a commodity, a space to occupy, not a home to cherish. There was something about that carelessness, that disregard, that cut deeper than I expected. I knew it wasn't his fault. He hadn't lived here, hadn't built this house with his own hands like I had. He hadn't raised a family here, hadn't witnessed the laughter and the love that once filled the rooms. But that didn't matter to him. So, I kept my distance. I stayed out of his way, did my job, and ignored the bitterness that welled up in me. I told myself that it didn't matter, that he wasn't worth my time, my thoughts, my anger, but it did matter. It mattered more than I had expected. The final straw came one afternoon, just as I was finishing my shift. The new owner was on the phone, pacing in the entryway. I wasn't supposed to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help overhearing his conversation. His tone was clipped, harsh. "No, I don't want that old man around here anymore. He's useless," he said, his voice rising. "If he can't do his job properly, I'll get someone else. There's plenty of guys out there willing to do this for half the price." I froze. The words stung, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. He was talking about me. I wasn't just invisible to him. I was disposable. I could feel the weight of it, the suffocating sense of being unwanted, like an old chair you leave out in the rain. But I didn't answer. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a scene. I just walked away. In that moment, I realized something. He wasn't the one who held the power here. He could throw me out, ignore me, treat me like dirt, but he couldn't take away what had once been mine. He couldn't take away the memories, the history, the sweat and tears that had gone into this house. And in the end, that was all I needed to remember. It wasn't about fighting back. It wasn't about confronting him or proving something. It was about something deeper, something more personal. And so, I made my decision. I would leave, but not in defeat. I would leave on my own terms. It wasn't revenge that drove me. It wasn't bitterness. It was something far quieter, far more powerful. The decision to reclaim my own peace, to move on from the life I had once built, to let go. And that would be my victory. The days that followed felt oddly liberating. In the quiet of my apartment, I found myself going through the motions of life, but with a sense of calm that had been absent for a long time. I'd made my decision. I would leave that job at the mansion, quietly and without fanfare. There was no need for a confrontation. There was no need for explanations. I had come to terms with the truth. It was time for me to move on. I'd been working at the mansion for several months now, but the last few weeks had felt particularly suffocating. The young man's dismissive attitude was only the final straw in a series of small indignities I'd endured. And I had had enough. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had once built a life here, in this house. I had poured my heart into it. And now I was a ghost in its halls, nothing more than a forgotten relic of a time that no longer mattered. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed to matter. I applied for a transfer, a quiet request to be moved to another property, one far away from the mansion. I didn't need to tell anyone why. I didn't need to explain. I simply signed the paperwork and waited for the response. A few days later, I received a letter confirming my transfer. They didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I packed my things and left the mansion without saying goodbye. There were no parting words, no dramatic exits, just a quiet departure, a final, silent step toward reclaiming my life. A week later, I found myself walking into a small, modest workshop I had rented in the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, a rundown building with peeling paint, but it was mine. It was a fresh start, a chance to do something I had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. I had a few savings from my years of working at the mansion, enough to set up a small woodworking shop. I could already picture it, shelves lined with fine craftsmanship, tables, chairs, and cabinets, each piece telling its own story. It was a simple dream, but it felt right. It felt like the kind of life I was meant to live, creating something with my hands, something that would last, something that would make a difference. The first few days were slow. There was a lot of cleaning up to do, a lot of organizing. But slowly, I began to fill the space with tools, with wood, with ideas. I even found time to carve out a small display area in the front of the workshop, where I could showcase the things I made. I wasn't in a rush. I wasn't looking for instant success. I was simply looking for peace, for the kind of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. Then, one day, the unexpected happened. The wife of the new owner of the mansion came into my shop. She was a woman of average height, dressed in expensive clothes, but her demeanor was quiet, almost reserved. She introduced herself as Mrs. Sinclair and explained that she had heard about my work from a friend. She needed something, an heirloom, she called it, something that could be passed down through the generations. It wasn't the kind of job I had expected, but I listened, nodded, and agreed to take it on. It was a simple request, an ornate wooden box, something to store precious items in. It wasn't the kind of thing I would have chosen to make, but there was something about her request that resonated with me. Maybe it was because it reminded me of my own past, the things I had once cherished, the things I had once built. Or maybe it was because it gave me a chance to prove something to myself, to show that I still had the skill, the passion, to create something meaningful. I took the job, and as I worked on it over the next few days, I couldn't help but think about the mansion. I thought about how it had once been mine, how I had built it with my own hands. I thought about the memories that lived within those walls, the laughter, the pain, the joy. and the loss. And I thought about how, in a way, this box, this simple, unassuming piece of wood, was a way of reclaiming that past. When I finished the box, I wrapped it carefully and delivered it to her. Mrs. Sinclair was impressed, and for a moment she looked at me as though she recognized something in me that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The job wasn't the point. The point was that I had done something, created something, with my own hands. And that, I realized, was all I needed. As I walked away from the mansion that day, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle within me. It wasn't the victory I had imagined. It wasn't the kind of grand confrontation that people often dream of. It was quieter, subtler, a personal victory, one that came from within. I had moved on. I had built something new, and in doing so, I had freed myself. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I didn't need to chase the past or live in its shadow. I had found something better, a life of my own, a life built on my own terms. And that was enough. A year had passed since I left the mansion, and in that time, my life had changed in ways I hadn't expected. My small workshop had grown into a steady business, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something with my hands had become a new kind of joy. It wasn't the fame or wealth that I had once dreamed of, but it was enough. It was mine. I'd heard through the grapevine that the new owner had sold the mansion and moved out. The house was empty now, standing silent on the hill, just as it had when I first entered its doors so many years ago. One afternoon, I found myself walking past it on my way to the workshop. I hadn't planned on going there, but my feet seemed to carry me toward it, as though drawn by some invisible force. I stood at the edge of the driveway, looking at the now empty house, the familiar landscape that had once been so much a part of my life. I wasn't angry. There was no bitterness left in me. The house was just a house now, empty, abandoned, like the memory of everything I had once built. But that wasn't where my life was anymore. My life was here, in the shop, in the small victories I had won. I walked to the fence that bordered the property and placed my hand on it. The metal was cold, but there was something comforting about the gesture. Something final. I didn't need to go back into the house. I didn't need to see it again. I smiled softly to myself, and then I turned away. I didn't look back. I was free.